Today we are solving one of the programming challenges in the book Starting Out with Java, and we are in chapter 7. And the problem we are solving today is problem 2 in the chapter 7. So the problem is called Payroll class. They gave us 7 employees with ID numbers, and they want us to calculate their wages and their hours. And we get their hours and the pay rate, and we have to calculate each employee's gross pay. So it's basically to practice arrays in this chapter. So let's start it. First, we have to create a class called a payroll class. So the first thing they gave us is this employee IDs. It's an integer array, and the integer array has 7 employees IDs. So each employee has an ID. Also, they gave us, they said hours. We have to also keep track of the hours they work for each employee. So the size would be, the size of hours array would be the employee's ID length. So basically it would be 7 employees that we want to calculate their hours. Also, we have to also ask each employee's pay rate, and the size is the same. The size is 7, which employee ID that length will give us. Also, lastly, they said we also have to keep track of the wages each employee gets, and we will say just 7 instead of saying employee ID that length. So first we have to calculate the wages each employee gets, and the easiest way to do that is to write a method, a public method that doesn't return anything. We'll say calculate wages, and we will create a for loop. We'll say int I0, I is less than employee ID dot length. We have to go to each employee's wage, and we have to store the wages in the wage field, and we have to access each employee's index, and the way we can do that is to use the I. And you say wage I equal hours I times pay rate of I, because they are arrays. So we have to go through each employee's pay rate and each employee's hours in order to get each employee's wages. So after that, we have to calculate employee ID. We have to make methods for that. We have to make methods for hours. We have to make methods for pay rate, and lastly we have to make methods for wages. So first we have to make employee ID methods, getters and setters for the employee ID array. So we'll just say get employee ID to get the employee ID array, also we'll say public int get. I'll just copy the name. I will say int index, and then I will return employee ID of index. Each time you give index to this method, it will pull the employee with that index. Also, we have to set the employee ID. Set employee ID. I will say index. You have to give an index, and we have to give the ID of the employee, and we will say this employee ID that has this index equal the ID that we give. So we get the employee ID, and we also get employee ID whenever someone gives an index, and we set employee ID. So next would be hours. We say get hours. We basically do the same thing, and public void set hours int index int hour, and we will say this hours of index. It will return hour, and get hour. Also, we want to say int get hour, and if someone gives hour, it should return return, instead of hour, I would say index. So here, for example, if someone wants to know each hour how much someone made, they will call this this method. Then we will say payRate. We will work on the payRate, and we'll say get payRate, and we will say public double get payRate, and it will give the index, and it will return payRate that has the index that we passed. Also, we have to set payRate as well. So we have to change something. You have to say int index, and here we have to say index equal payRate. So we finished the payRate, and lastly we have to work on the wages. We say get wages, and we'll say public double get wages. If someone passes an index, we have to return wages. And also, if someone wants to know a specific ID, if a specific wage for a specific employee, we have to say double get wage, and we'll say ID. We'll say for int I equals 0, I is less than 7, I is incremented by 1 each time. We'll say if ID, the ID that the person passes to this method, if it's equal to employee of I, and we will say if the ID matches, then we want to return that ID. we want to return not employee, but we want to return the wage of I. So if the ID matches, we want to return the wage for that employee. If it doesn't, we will just return 0. I will just say negative 99 for to represent we didn't find the ID that we were looking for. So I think we finished all the methods. Firstly, we created all the arrays, employee ID, hours, pay rate, wages, and we calculated each employee's wage. We get the employee ID, hours, and we got the pay rate, and lastly we got the wages. So next we will create the main class that would test this class. So we have to create the main class to test the payroll class. So what we would do is we right click the source folder and write main class. So basically what we want to do is we want to create the payroll class as a static member. Say payroll, we say scanner, and we have to create the main method to run the class. So the first thing, we have to give the person a menu to choose whether they want to add employees or view employees data or exit the game. So I will call the method start. So public static void start. So the first thing what happens is that the first thing the program starts, it will be presented whether they want to add employee data, whether they want to view employee data, or they want to finish. And lastly, we want to collect their choice. Say int choice scanner next int. So whatever they choose, the choice variable will hold. Then we have to use switch statements. The switch statements would take the choice, and the first case, if the user chooses 1, then that means we add employee. If the user presses 2, that means we view employee. And if the user enters 3, we terminate the program by using system.exit 0. It's not necessary, but I like to call the default keyword for the switch statements. After that, I would like to give a space between the adding employee and viewing employee methods. Say view employee, and first thing would be public static void add employee. Then we will say for int I 0, I less than 7, because we want to run all 7 employees. Before we go to the for loop, we want to get the array of IDs from the payroll class, get employee IDs. And first thing we would say is enter employee number IDs of I worked hours. The first employee is how many hours they worked for that week, and we will store it whatever they enter for that employee in the hours variable. Then in the book they said hours cannot be a negative number, so we have to validate that. So we will say while hours is less than 0, we will say error, hours cannot be a negative number. And then we'll say hours equals scanner next int. And if the hours are not a negative number, then we want to set hours. We'll set the index, which is I, and hours. After that, you have to ask the payroll, the pay rate for that employee. You will say enter pay rate. And again, we have to collect the pay rate. It will say scanner next double. And as they said in the book, we have to validate it. And the pay rate cannot be less than $6. And if it is less than $6, we will say pay rate cannot be less than $6. And they will say pay rate equal scanner next double. And if the program comes here, that means the pay rate is either $6 or over $6. So we have to set the pay rate. We have to say set the pay rate with index of I and the pay rate. And after we collect all the hours and the pay rate for each employee, what we want is give a space, and we have to calculate each employee's wage by using calculate wages. And after we collect all the data, we want to call the view employee data. But before that, we have to create it. Void view employee. We will say view employee data. Again, we have to give a space. Then we use for loop int I 0, I less than 7, I is incremented by 1 each time. And first thing would be employee ID number. And we can find by using payroll, get employee, and we pass the index which I contains. Then we print the hours. We'll say payroll get hours of I. We print payRate, and the payRate, we'll say payroll get payRate, and we pass the I. And lastly, we printed the gross wage, and it will say payroll get wage of I. And lastly, we will give a space between employees data. And I think we are done. We have to give employee data as a title. It is not necessary, but I like to give the title. So we created two fields for this class, the payroll that we created earlier, and we created the scanner class to get keyboard input. We created the main method, which would run the program, and inside the main method, we called the start method, which would give us the menu of the game and of the program, I mean. So we created the start method. We gave a print. We printed the 3 menus, the first being to add employee data, the second to view employee data, and lastly to finish the program. And also we gave a way for the user to enter their choice. Once the user enters the choice will be stored in the choice variable, and in the switch statement, the choice will be tested each time. The first case would be 1. If the user enters 1, then we will call add employee. If the user enters 2, it would call view employee, and if the user enters 3, it will terminate the program. And here I gave a space, and I called the view employee method when the program ends adding the employees. And here in the add employee method, we created an int array to hold all the IDs of the employees. We created a for loop. We printed the first prompt to ask the employer's worked hours, and we stored in the hours variable, and we validated the hours. As long as the hours is not a negative number, we store it in the payroll class set hours method, and we ask the pay rate for each employee, and we validated the pay rate. As long as the pay rate is not less than $6, we store it in the set pay rate method. And after the loop ends, we just calculate the wages for each employee, and we called the view employee data to see the each employee's payroll and wages. And here, lastly, in the last method, it is view employee, and we created a space, empty space, and we created a title. We created a for loop that would iterate 7 times for the 7 employees, and each time the loop will print each employee's ID, hours, pay rate, and gross pay for each employee. So let's run the program and see if the program works as we expected. Okay, as you can see, I don't want the menu to have to be only one line, so let's change that. So we will say before the 2, we add new line for the second and third options. So let's run it again. Yeah, now it works as we expected. So they gave us three options: to add employees, to view employees, and to exit the program. So let's add employees by pressing 1. And they said enter employee with the ID of this worked hours. So let's test if our validation works. Let's say we worked negative 1. The validation works. That says errors hours cannot be a negative number. And let's say we worked 40 hours, and they said enter a pay rate. Let's say we only our pay rate is $5. It says error pay rate cannot be less than $6. So let's say we made $20. Enter employee, the second employee. Okay, let's say we worked 40 hours and we made $30 per hour. We continue. As you can see, after we after we added all the 7 employees, their hours and their pay rate, here are the employee data for each employee. The first employee ID is this, and he or she worked 40 hours, and the pay rate is $20, and the gross wages are $800 because 20 times 40 is 800. The second employee worked 40 hours. He makes $30 per hour, and he got 1,200 gross wages, and this will continue until we finish all the data. But is there a repeat? I think there is a repeat. I don't think we need this after. I don't think we have to call the view employee method after the menu, after we start the menu. After we start the program, we don't want to call the employee data. We only want to call the view employee data after we entered each employee's data. Let's run it one more time to make sure the program works correctly. Okay, 140. Okay. Here's the employee data. This is the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. Yeah, now it works just fine. We ask the employee data, and we display all the employee data. Let's run it last time for checking if the finish functionality works for our program when we press number 3. Does the program terminates or not? Yes, it does. So that would be it for this class, for this programming challenge, payroll class. And I hope you guys find it useful. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. And I will see you next time.